On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, we speak with Professor David Deavel from the University of St. Thomas in Houston, a popular columnist for Gilbert Magazine and one of the speakers at this summer's Chesterton Conference.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Well, welcome, David. It's a pleasure to have you. And we were talking a little bit before I hit record about. I'm sure we have crossed paths, but I'm looking forward to seeing you again at a conference in the summer and hopefully raising a glass with you at the Afterglow after your great talk. So we do want to kind of preview that talk a little bit for the audience and talk about sort of your inspiration and your idea behind it. But before we get into that, just in case the viewers and listeners are unfamiliar with you, they might not be subscribers to Gilbert Magazine. They should be. But just in case they're not, maybe introduce yourself for our listeners.
Yeah, thanks. I've been writing for Gilbert now for probably close to 20 years and a contributing editor there. So you'll usually see I'm usually either writing a Miscellany of Men column or a book review. But I write in a number of other places. I'm a senior contributor at the Imaginative Conservative. I write columns for AMAC Newsline, it's sort of the conservative AARP. I usually am once or twice a month in Catholic World Report. And right now I'm doing some work I've written before for the Exodus 90 group, sort of men's Catholic spirituality group. Some Protestants do it too. But I'm writing some material for them. So for any guys who are looking for a program that will help them live Catholic discipleship, that's a good place. You'll be finding some of my material there as well.
Well, great, and I'll see if we can put some links down in the show notes where people can maybe go and explore some of your writing. Of course, I am most familiar with you as a writer for Gilbert Magazine, and I really do appreciate the Miscellany of Men column. Perhaps if you could maybe just elucidate what that column is about and why it's there, because I know some people are a little bit mystified by our masthead sometimes because we pull
Yeah.
these titles out of Chestertonia that like straws in the wind, and people unfamiliar with the Daily News, or excuse me, GK's Weekly and Chesterton's column there wouldn't know what that refers to. So maybe just give a little bit of the background of that column that you so frequently write for, Miscellany of Men.
Yeah. As you note, that the title itself comes from one of Chesterton's book titles, A Miscellany of Men, and it was a compilation of different essays that he wrote about different types of people. And oftentimes, the types will be illuminated by actual people. So our column in Gilbert is actually dedicated to people who influenced Chesterton or were influenced by Chesterton or knew Chesterton or had some sort of contact with Chesterton. So you'll see people from, mostly from the last couple hundred years, sometimes a little bit older than that. But I've written in that space columns on people who influenced Chesterton, Anglo-Catholic priests. I've written about people who were influenced by him directly, and many writers and academics. I've written about, especially foreigners. My most recent column in that space was about the Norwegian Catholic convert novelist Sigrid Undset, who some people called the Norwegian Chesterton. She's a fantastic writer. She translated some of Chesterton's works into Norwegian, and so we try to draw out in that column these different people with their connections. Some for good, some for ill. Robert Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, took a lot of Chesterton's structures, but he didn't have a Chestertonian philosophy of life. He was actually much more like one of Chesterton's nihilists or pessimists. But nevertheless, we liked it's a miscellany, which means it's a mixed grouping. So it's really fun to write about them, whether they're saints or sinners or somewhere in between that.
Yeah, it's a great column, and I think very, very Chestertonian. It's striking how much of Chesterton is, no matter what book you're reading, he's very much in always in that journalistic mode where he's, he makes such frequent and ready reference to Shaw, to Wells, to
Yeah,
other persons and their biographies, and it was clearly something that he valued as a method. This kind of biological or biographical, excuse me, approach where you could draw out a type. And I often encourage people when reading Chesterton that if they get lost in the names, to to see the trees rather than the forest. In other words, don't worry that you don't know who Lord Asquith is, or who Shaw was. You'll gather what kind of person he's talking about, and that's really the point that Chesterton's trying to make.
that's right. And well, and we live in a time which, for all its defects, most of us have ready access to the internet, and it's very easy to look up who these people he was talking about were. And oftentimes that's very good to do, to see what kind of a figure he's referring to. But what I like about him is, as you note, he's very interested in types, but he also is utterly aware of the individuality of each person. And
Hmm.
so his relationships, which were, intellectually and spiritually adversarial with people like H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw, were nevertheless often personally affectionate, and that's something that I think everybody loves about Chesterton, is that there's something almost, there's something very holy about that. That even in the figures that we can think of as sort of intellectual villains, he can actually see what's good about them and draw that out. And when he wrote about people like Shaw and Wells, he often did that.
Yeah, I agree. And what a witness for our age, and so much needed, more now probably than ever, to be able to see through difference, the common humanity there. Um, well, we do want to get kind of into your conference talk, but I would be remiss after you mentioning your recent column in Gilbert Magazine, not to mention to the viewers and listeners that one of the talks at this summer's conference, in addition to David's talk, will be by Dr. Amy Fahey of the St. Thomas More College of the Liberal Arts. And that talk will be on Sigrid Undset. So if you're
Yeah.
interested in the Norwegian Chesterton, Sigrid Undset, you can read David's column in the recent Gilbert magazine, and then you can listen to Dr. Fahey at this summer's conference and learn even more about her. So uh, I'm looking forward very much to that one. Uh, but now turning to your talk, and before we get into that, maybe just sort of, we're Chestertonians. We're all amateurs in a way. However, you mentioned your writing and stuff, but perhaps your professional background and your professorship as sort of your credentials for why you're going to be approaching this topic in particular.
Yeah, I actually teach theology here at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. I have a doctorate in theology. For those of you who are Chestertonians who take bias against academics, I don't want to say I'm one of the good ones, but I try to be one of the good ones.
Yeah.
But that's my topic that I talk about. I've done courses on Christian spirituality and particularly thinking about how Chesterton operates. So I've always been fascinated by holiness. That how is it that those who follow Christ reflect His light in different ways? And although Christ is the center of all holiness, He parcels out His light on His own disciples, and kind of like a prism. Uh, the one beautiful light that He gives comes out in very different colors. And that's what I've been fascinated by in Chesterton's writings, is that he sees that although the world thinks that people, you know, Christians, Catholics, they're all the same, that's boring. What really breaks out is, the villains and the people who dare to be bad or something like that. Really, the opposite is true, that the different colors are actually seen most clearly on those who actually love God. and want to let him illuminate their own existence.
Hmm.
So it's there. This talk is because of my love of Chesterton. I bet it also has a little bit of professional relevance to what I do on my day-to-day work too.
That's great. So yes, your talk's going to be on kind of Chesterton and the saints, and of course we're familiar with the two great biographies of Saint Francis of Assisi and Saint Thomas Aquinas that Chesterton wrote. But maybe just speak a little bit about what you're drawing from in Chesterton, again, without spoiling the talk, but kind of like what
Yeah,
source material do you look for, uh, in addressing this topic? Uh,
yeah. Yeah, obviously those two biographies are going to be, will be front and center, but I'm going to be looking at other things. And particularly, I want to look at, as I said, right, the holiness of the saints is not sort of their own holiness that's separate, but instead it's how they are filled by God's Spirit to become, Christians are little Christ. So I want to look a little bit at what he says in the Everlasting Man, which is 100 years old, right, as well, and because how he depicts saints will depend on how he depicts Jesus Christ. And the way he depicts Jesus Christ in The Everlasting Man, particularly, is as a real flesh and blood human being, but also he's a divine person ultimately. And he's interesting, he's thrilling,
mhm.
because he does manifest all of the sides of what it means to be human except sin. So I want to look at that, and then I want to look at those great biographies. But I also want to look at his depictions of other kinds of figures who were maybe canonized saints, but also other holy people that he respected. Including people like Savonarola, but also people who weren't necessarily saints at the time he was writing about them, Joan of Arc, and they pop up as almost everything does in Chesterton's writings, almost everywhere. So I'll be drawing from a lot of different source material, but particularly those two biographies of Francis and Thomas, and then also as well many poems.
Well, I'm excited to hear it, and I think we mentioned earlier with Chesterton's virtue of finding common ground, finding the good in a person despite difference, and how that is very timely for today. I think this is too, because I think that while it's a temptation in every age of the church probably to have a little bit of narrowness or to instantiate these kinds of shibboleths that aren't necessarily the requirement of the church or the requirement of the gospel, but attuned to the preferences of maybe the majority or maybe a very vocal minority. I think we see that today, this kind of factionalism in the church and in society amongst Christians, and it's very damaging to recognize that there are different to not recognize that there are different approaches or ways to holiness. Maybe just speak a little bit about that and sort of the timeliness of this topic.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing is that, and you can probably, I'm sure that the Society of G.K. Chesterton still sells t shirts and other things that say, you know, uh, break the conventions, but keep the commandments. But that really summarizes his own view. As I said, what's interesting are the people who actually keep the commandments, and they're able to see something that's broader. Like I said, I teach theology. Yesterday, I've been teaching a moral theology class, and in that class, we were talking about how having the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity actually change the way ordinary virtues like prudence operate, because they give you a broader vision of what's possible to do in this life because it's been lit up by God. And that's how Chesterton saw these saints and these figures who were would-be saints, is that they saw a broader canvas. Their prudence might not be like our prudence, but that allowed them to go full guns a blazing. This is one of the things that he says, is that the thing about saints is that they're not boring. He says, they can be meek, and they can be fierce. And we say, well, but lots of people can be meek and fierce. And he says, well, but Christians the Christian fierce people are fiercest crusaders, and the meek saints are meek beyond all decency, right? So they actually show the possibilities of being more extreme than anybody else. They go out there, and that's why they can do things like in the St. Francis biography, right? That's one of the things that he depicts about Francis, is that Francis goes beyond all decency in all sorts of ways, and opening himself up, to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that he sees are really opportunities that are given by God and the touch by God. And same goes with the fierce Crusader saints, that they are ready to fight and fight until the death in a way that everybody can see how beautiful that is. And that diversity extends beyond just meek and fierce. Some are penny pinching, and some are extravagant, and some are bookish, and some are, almost seem like they're, refusing to have any sort of intellectual knowledge at all. And all of those extremes actually come from the fact that they are emphasizing different parts of the one truth that is Jesus Christ. And that's what's great about Saints for Chesterton.
Yeah, and such a consolation, because I think it can always be tempting. Again, as I said, it's probably perennial. No, it certainly is perennial, because you even see this in um, the letters of Saint Paul. Don't say you are of Apollos, or you are of Paul. Is Christ divided? Right? This kind of temptation to factionalism, or comparing oneself. But nowadays, in the social media era, especially, I think it can be a real temptation for Christians, and a real temptation to disheartenment, or even despair, because people aren't putting their failures online. They're not putting their vulnerabilities online. They're putting their successes. So you see the trad wife with everything
Yeah.
completely lined up, and I'm sure that can be a trial for some people, to see how pristine the home looks, and how well
Yeah.
dressed the kids are, and kneeling at church, and all wonderfully. But yeah, there
Mhm.
are these different approaches, these different ways to be holy, and that should be a great consolation for us as we try to find our place where God is calling us to be in the church.
Yeah, I mean, Chesterton himself is a great example of this. I mean, he was a man, obviously, of deep prayer. I mean, his friends, said that he would, when he would come into the room, he would make the sign of the cross, often with his cigar, of course, right?
Hmm.
Um, but he also was a man who didn't have it all together. If for those of your listeners who've never read Maisie Ward's great biography, Maisie Ward actually knew him. I mean, she has so many great details, some of them from knowing him.
Hmm.
She records that at one point, he came down to breakfast when she was visiting, and he had two ties on. And she said, "Gilbert, you have two ties on." He said, "Oh, I guess I must be paying too much attention to my dress." That's the kind of humility that you get from somebody who, as he liked to say, you know, uh, well, he could have levity because he took himself lightly.
Yeah, and it's really a sign of a grace and a virtue in him, that I think that he managed it, um, just like all the saints do. He managed it without sin, and that's the challenge. You look at whether it be the meekness, or the fierceness, or self-abnegation, or you know going out there and kind of being a propagandist for the faith, in all of those things. So there's not only multiple ways of being a saint, but there's also, in each one of those avenues, the attendant danger of doing it to excess, or doing it in the wrong spirit and in the wrong
Yeah,
way. And so, this is something we're at the society constantly endeavoring now to remind people of, that you hear these anecdotes about Chesterton. It's not that slovenliness is good for slob, like there
right.
is a sense in which, being diligent and being, put together is part of Christian duty too. So that's not what we're celebrating. Rather, what we're celebrating is what it represents about the man, that he
That's
was so uh, thoughtless of self. He was so other directed, and so humble, that he would literally forget himself in those situations, and it's that we can aspire to.
That's right.
It's not, I hear so often misquoted, a thing worth doing is worth doing badly, as sort of a
Right.
cheap excuse. That's not what he means by that at all, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, and he saw, and what I think one of the things that I like about him is, I mean, it's sometimes overdone because he himself could be fierce at times. You know,
Hmm.
you read some of his poems and some of his political columns. I mean, he himself was fierce about a number of topics, but generally speaking, he was fairly mild toward his enemies, and uh, his friend Hilaire Belloc was much fiercer, generally speaking, in real life. I mean, all the stories about Belloc are, they're all generally speaking hilarious. I mean, Ronald Knox, Monsignor Ronald Knox, liked to tell the story about Belloc going into Westminster Cathedral, and he was at mass, and at one point he was kneeling when everybody was standing, and the usher came over and said to him, uh, sir, this we stand at this point, and of course Belloc looked up and said, "Go to hell." And of course, the response of the usher was, "Oh, pardon me, I didn't know you were a Catholic." I mean, it was, Chesterton. You can't imagine Chesterton reacting that way,
No.
and you can't imagine Chesterton being quite as fierce, even in his writing, as Belloc was, and yet he appreciated Belloc and appreciated that fierceness as well, even if Belloc didn't always reciprocate. After Chesterton died, Belloc wrote that, the place of G.K. Chesterton in English letters, and he kind of criticized Chesterton for not having he didn't follow through and strike down his enemies with the sword. And I think Chesterton appreciated Belloc's ability to do that and willingness to do that at times. But for Chesterton, his goal was actually to kind of woo people back to faith, or to get them as close to faith as possible. He wanted to introduce them to Jesus, and it often came through. H.G. Wells, of course, said that, he didn't think that he was ever going to make it to heaven if there were such a place. But if he did, it would be because of his friendship with G.K. Chesterton.
Mm.
And I think that's a great testimony to the fact that, Chesterton didn't always strike down all of his enemies, but that's because he saw them as potential friends and also potential saints.
Yeah, and he had the trust to know that, he wasn't God, he wasn't the Holy Spirit. He had the trust to know that there are other interactions that take place, and we can only be responsible for so much. And I think, again, just a great lesson, reminder for us nowadays. We can worry. We're much more Martha than Mary, I think, in our approach to so much of life, and we worry about a great many things. And sometimes we think we just have to win this argument, we have to win this fight, this battle. Truth must be vindicated at all times. But in that, I think you see the lack sometimes of the trust that the tares in the wheat will grow, and that, God will thresh them out in the end. He's
Right.
taking responsibility for that. Not to say that we're complacent to our duty to correct and reprove, but we don't always have to win that fight right now. I think that's a temptation.
Well, Gilbert Chesterton, he liked to win arguments, but I think he did like to win men and women more than he even liked to win arguments.
Amen.
And sometimes the best way to do that is, to follow his friend Monsignor Knox's advice that we need to pray for the grace to shut up at times. So,
That's right. Well, turning a little bit, as we get towards closing here, towards just the general Chesterton conference. David, you've been several times attendee, I assume, and
yeah,
maybe just
I'm
speak
even
about
wearing an old Chesterton conference shirt, so
that. Is
I
quite
put
a
that on,
Yeah, that's
knowing
quite an
knowing I'd
old
be.
one back then when they had the
Yeah,
when we
this
did
was
those.
this was like maybe Seattle, like 2012 or something. I forget which one.
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe just we're asking this of kind of a lot of our guests, especially those that have experienced it before, to sort of make the pitch for the viewers and listeners out there. who are unsure.
Yeah.
Have to take a trip to New Orleans, and it's going to be maybe a little hot and humid at that time of the year.
Yeah.
Although I think that that's overblown. I don't think it's nearly as bad as people say, having been there myself. But
Now
uh,
that I'm in Houston, New Orleans doesn't seem quite so bad.
that's
So,
right. But yeah, make us out. What's your favorite part about the conference, or what do you think people
yeah.
simply don't want to miss?
Well, I mean, I like to put it this way. It is one of those there are I since I do academic stuff, you go to conferences that can be quite dull at times, and people speaking only to their narrow subject. But this is a conference where everybody's talking about Chesterton, and so there's common ground in all the talks and the events. But there's also just a great and joyful spirit that permeates the place. There are often little kids running around. It's a family event. People are talking to each other, and it's a group of lots of different people from all different backgrounds. And so you'll meet academics like me, and you'll meet people doing everything else under the sun, and you'll meet people from all over the country and all over the world, and they want to be there, and they want to celebrate the witness of this great Christian apologist and writer. And in the evenings, those afterglows that you mentioned, where people are all sitting around, usually, oftentimes outside. I don't know how we'll manage that. It's probably cool enough, maybe in the summer in New Orleans, to sit outside. But everybody's sitting around and having a drink and having a smoke. Maybe not everybody, but most people are, and they're talking, and they're talking about the things that are light, and they're also thinking about the most serious things. Which, as if you're a Chesterton fan, you know that those don't contradict each other, because it's all part of one great gift that we have. So, if you've not been to the Chesterton conference, you really need to go, because it's a party.
Yes, it is. And as Dale likes to say every year, but I think we can say it this year, it's probably going to be the best one ever. So, by all means, if you haven't yet, click the link down in the description and book yourself your registration. You certainly won't regret it. You'll hear a lot of great talks, including David's, and I look forward to that very
Thank you.
much. David, thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
And thank you, our viewers and listeners. Again, do all the things that the algorithms require. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, share this with your friends. We want this content to reach more and more people. More and more people need these important lessons, these witnesses of charity, of patience, of humility that Chesterton offers, and the saints of whom he writes offers, and of course, the everlasting man, Jesus Christ, offers. And so we want to get that out there in front of as many people as possible. And please do join us this July down in New Orleans for the annual Chesterton Conference, and bring a friend, because, as we like to say, Chesterton is always better with friends. Till next time, God bless.